So the objective here is economic growth, right? This is something that I've talked about quite a bit in the past in terms of how it is that we get uh, uh, how do we stimulate the economy, so on and so forth. What the drivers are behind that, uh, again, et cetera. But anyways, looking at its roots, if you will, how do we go about growing this economy? A couple we're revisiting here our production possibility curve or production possibility frontier, just again to try to illustrate what it is we actually mean by this economic growth and how we go about doing it, how we go about making that happen. So in the first graph on the left, what we show is that production possibility curve being pushed outward. Okay, how do we go about doing that? Variety of things. In this case, we're looking at technological improvements. So we're talking about capital, more specifically about physical capital, so far as that circular flow is concerned. So by employing or deploying uh, more, better, improved physical capital, we're able to become more efficient. Okay, we're able to what? To become more productive. Okay, again, that's the rationale behind, by the way, employing technology is that um, we would only use it if it made us more efficient, made us more productive. So again, efficiency is the maximum number of goods and services at the lowest possible price. So this would be again for the firm. It's beneficial for the firm because what do? It reduces their cost, right? And by reducing their cost, that could be translated into per unit cost, and so being able to either produce more with the same amount of material, or resources, if you will, or some smaller ratio kind of going forward by deploying or employing this physical capital. Anyway, so that's again how that production possibility curve gets pushed out. Remember, you can't go beyond your production possibility curve. However, you can push that production possibility curve outward by uh, uh, increasing your productive resource mix somehow, some way. More people, um, by having again the physical capital, uh, uh, the that could be a way of again pushing that production possibility curve out. And the reverse, of course, is that if you shrink inward, reducing your production possibility curve or moving it closer to the origin, that would be it would be less efficient. And so this again, the example we always use is unemployment. When you have unemployment, you're not using all of your productive resources. In this case, your productive resource, labor. Okay. Anyway, again, so this is that the idea is that pushing that production possibility curve out. On the right hand side, this is when we're looking at moving from one point on that production possibility curve to another. So on the left-hand side, this speaks to that production possibility curve in terms of pushing the production possibility curve out. And on the right-hand side, we're talking about redeploying those resources so that we can do what? So we can produce more capital goods. But in order to produce more capital goods, remember capital goods are like robots and automated equipment, automation. And the reason that we do that is so that we can do what? Produce more consumer goods down the road. But in order to do that, in order to produce more capital goods, we would have to forego, um, so there's opportunity cost involved, of course. We would have to forego some consumer goods in the meantime, okay? Anyway, so on the left-hand side is productive efficiency, and the right-hand side is again that moving from the production possibility curve, moving from one part of the production possibility curve to another, redeploying those productive resources. So to reiterate once again, this production possibility frontier production possibility curve. So for moving along that curve, that would be allocative efficiency, moving from more consumer goods to more capital goods. That would be allocative efficiency. We're allocating our productive resources differently in order to accomplish that goal. Versus productive efficiency, again, that's any point along that production possibility curve, okay? And again, briefly on the right-hand side, we're looking at our circular flow, which is something that we always come back to repeatedly throughout the course. And again, the idea is that you're looking at it in two different ways. In terms of when we're talking about economic growth, that's that GDP, gross domestic product. So in order to, so that's that portion that's going to where? Going from the firm to the household. Or it's also government expenditures, again, firm producing most of those goods and services for government. And also the export piece of it is that those goods and services that are being produced at the firm that are what exported, sent to another country. And finally, the investment piece, that is that firm, in essence, they're reinvesting, producing goods, we're going back into that firm itself. So all of these, and they're different, in those different categories, are things that do what? Add to that GDP. Remember, gross domestic product is what? Gross domestic product is the final, the sale price, if you will, of all the goods and services that are produced over a period of time. So maybe for a year, for example, we're talking about. So that would be that PCE, or the personal consumption expenditures. That's the largest portion going to the household, but also starting from the top of right on these injections, that investment piece, again, those robots and whatnot that are being purchased, being built at the firm and being purchased by some other part of the firm, if you will, or maybe that firm itself, producing those goods and services, and then the government expenditures, that would be government, buying those goods and services. So again, being produced again at the firm, and lastly, of course, would be the exports. Exports again being produced at the firm. So that kind of ties it together, hopefully. So continuing on with this GDP, or gross domestic product, next what I want to do is show you something, how the U.S. relates to the rest of the world in terms of gross domestic product. And the way we kind of measure these, I think this is through what's called the PPP, Purchasing Power Parity, where they try to put everything in dollars in this case, to see how we compare to the rest of the world. And the U.S. is the juggernaut, right? So with on the left-hand side, this is from 2023, and the more recent one is on the right from 2025. So out of 105 trillion in 2023, the U.S. had about 27 trillion dollars worth of that. So again, more than one quarter of that GDP, the world's GDP, if you will, for or I guess it wouldn't be GDP, it would be gross world product. How about that? GWP. Anyway, so the largest portion is the U.S., and the U.S. has been top dog, so to speak, for a very, very long time. Nonetheless, China is not too far behind. And I wonder sometimes about the actual what if the Chinese numbers are actually correct or not. But regardless, this is kind of these are the numbers that we have to deal with, right? So the U.S. is by far the largest, and then China comes in second, and then after that it breaks down between, I think India is actually third now, and actually I take it back, Germany is third, and India is fourth. So India is really growing like wildfire out there, okay? So again, the idea here is that, actually I guess Japan is four, but anyway, top five again would be the U.S., China, Germany, um, Japan, and India. Not necessarily roughly in that order, but again, India is growing just very, 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 very rapidly. So again, the idea here is again that the U.S. is still the largest economy in the world by far, and going forward, of course, we want that to, to continue on that trajectory. Not necessarily that we don't want the rest of the world to grow as well, but we certainly want the U.S. to continue to grow. So that's kind of the objective, if you will. And looking at it, speaking of objective, looking at it objectively, I don't have the numbers here, but I think I may have them a little bit later. But the idea is that the U.S. economy has really out blown right past, if you will, the European Union. Over the last maybe 10, 15 years ago, they were about the same. And now the U.S. has gone quite a bit, it's growing quite a bit faster at a faster rate than the European Union. Anyway, just interesting stuff to know. And this is something important because this is all about what? Economic growth. So it's one thing to have like that overall raw number of so far as the GDP is concerned, but it's also something that we always want to focus on, or something that we always come back to, is that per capita GDP, or what we mean by per capita is per person. So per capita, that's Latin. Anyway, per person GDP. And what you'll notice, this is interesting, going from 2014 through 2024, these countries have shifted quite a bit. Not all of them, but there is quite a bit of shifting going on. So Qatar was number one, of course, in 2014. 2024, that Luxembourg has taken its place. So Luxembourg, of course, is a very, very small country in Europe, and it's a banking center is really what it's about. This is their financial services and so on, and et cetera. This is many of these countries are major financial centers, okay? And it wouldn't just be Luxembourg, but Macau is part of Germany, or excuse me, Germany, part of China. And that's also, again, a major banking center, if you will. Interestingly enough, Ireland is number third in 2024. It's up quite a bit from 2014, and that is owed to in Ireland. It's the reason Ireland has such a high income, if you will. Again, the reason it's so high is because it is there's a very low they have a very low corporate tax rate, and lots of companies have chosen Ireland for their headquarters, right? So this is where there's a lot of action because of that. So lower taxes, that's what you'd expect, right? The capital, if you will, the financial capital is going to flow to where the costs are lower, right? Where it's most efficient where it makes most sense. So anyhow, this, as individuals, in many ways, corporations act like individuals, right? They're always trying to do what? Firms are trying to reduce their costs, just as households. We try to reduce our cost as well. We all like efficiency, the maximum number of goods and services at the lowest possible price. So anyway, the real takeaway from this is the U.S. The U.S. has moved up as well so far as this listing is concerned. And again, this is 2024, and 2025 is a bit hard to see. We'll just stick with the graph on the left. The one on the right is interesting, but we'll just stick with the graph on the left. And that being, again, that the U.S. has an $85,000 per capita. Again, per capita means per person GDP, right? And if you notice, all of the countries above the U.S., Luxembourg down to San Marino, they're all very, very small countries. Population-wise, they're quite small. In fact, if you add them all together, they're probably, less than one half the size of the U.S. So what's remarkable about the U.S. is, again, that we're looking at a population of 350 million people, and with that high of a per person GDP, it's just, again, remarkable. It just the U.S. is the place, right? This is, in spite of our issues, problems that we have, the U.S. This income that's associated with this that huge GDP piece is just phenomenal, as opposed to like a China. So China, if you now they were number two so far as overall GDP. However, they have a population of 1. I think 1.2 or 1.3 billion. India about the same. And so if you break that out per person, it's significantly less than the U.S. Right? Anyway, something of note, another way of looking at this GDP picture. So moving on from GDP, I want to focus a bit on labor productivity. Now this is typically a micro topic. Nonetheless, it's something that's appropriate because again, when we talk about productivity, this is how we grow an economy. This is where economic growth comes from. You know, that efficiency and that productivity. So efficiency again is that maximum number of goods and services at the lowest possible price. And how do we achieve that? By being more productive, right? This is the objective again. So there's an expression called the derived demand for labor. And what that means is that you know, where the demand is actually coming from, you know, for the labor. On the one hand, it's going to be at the firm demanding that productive resource labor in order to do what? In order to produce goods and services for whom? For the household as consumer, right? So you could look at it as that demand coming from the household, you know, from pulling products, if you will, again from the firm, or you could say it's coming from the firm pulling productive resources to produce those goods and services, once again for the household. Anyway, so firms buy productive resources from the household, for example, labor, could be anything else, right? Or all of the above, meaning labor, entrepreneurship, capital, and land. The product produced by that resource is called that physical product. So the physical product, what is actually being produced at the firm, and the productivity then comes from that compensation per hour for those productive resources that are being employed, and the actual physical product that's actually produced. So in this case, we're looking at an example of something I've used a lot, lug nuts, right? Lug nuts, everyone knows what a lug nut is. A lug nut is what attaches your wheel to the hub of your axle, right? It's something where you know make sure they're on there tight, not too tight, but tight enough so that they don't fall off. Anyway, those are lug nuts. This is something that pretty much every vehicle, I think, every vehicle would have lug nuts. So in this case, we're saying the production of those lug nuts, right? So again, the title here is a connection between lug nuts and productivity, something very, very simple. But bear in mind, this is pretty much how the BLS, or the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Department of Labor, under the Department of Labor, how they determine or how they calculate productivity, how they measure productivity. And this is something that the BLS, they publish like on a quarterly basis. But again, for our example here, on the left-hand side, we are looking at the hourly compensation of labor, moving rightward on that row. So remember, columns are up and down and rows are side to side, horizontal. So it's hourly compensation at $20 an hour. Okay, and then the next column over, so that's the column with the that's that first column, and then the second column over, we're saying that we're looking at the productivity increase, and then finally the last column is that with an increase in labor, the price of labor. Anyhow, so that hourly compensation, $20 an hour, and what we're producing in that 1 hour is 100 lug nuts, right? So the unit labor cost, so the cost associated with the labor in this production is 20 cents per lug nut. So in the next column over again, if we're going to increase productivity, the hourly compensation stays the same at $20 an hour, but we're increasing that physical productivity by 10%, right? So we're going from 100 to 110, and then if we divide that unit by the to come up with a unit labor cost, it's down to 18 cents. So the unit labor cost is reduced. It's pretty straightforward. But again, when we're talking about the physical productivity of labor, that we're just looking at 1 hour. So we're being very, very specific about this. But how did we make that? How did we make the increase from 100 to 110? Typically, it comes down to technology, right? So we're adding some technology. We could be tweaking the production process in terms of like, the actual labor that's being employed as well. But usually what happens is that at some point in time, we run out of room to increase that productivity of labor, and we end up moving more towards some technology in terms of some automated equipment or reshuffling the line to make the things to make more sense. So again, that's an increase in productivity of 10%. And the next column over is we're increasing the cost of labor. So the cost of labor, again, that's inflation, right? Goes up by 10% from $20 up to $22. And the physical productivity of that labor it's remained the same from the beginning of 100, and as a result of which we end up with a unit labor cost of 22 cents. So the unit labor cost goes up. So again, if the labor goes up, the cost of labor goes up, all else equal, productivity stays the same, then your unit labor cost is going to go up. Very simple, easy to understand, and yet this is something that again is very, very important that to get your head wrapped around. So here, a couple of questions here. How has productivity changed over the years? I've already alluded to it or mentioned it as well, I should say. And that is that typically we think of increases in productivity as associated with technology. So we're adding technology. And so think about this way. So why do we add technology? Why do we change the process? We're trying to do what? Increase our efficiency. We're trying to lower our cost and increase our productivity in the process, right? Either producing more for a lower per unit cost or just the same amount for a lower per unit cost, right? So that's kind of the idea behind this productivity. And one more time, that productivity has changed drastically over the years. So if you think about, when I say labor versus capital, think about something labor intensive like a farming type of a scenario. Talked about this repeatedly in the past, but the idea is that if you take a farm from 120 years ago, so the year 1900 versus a farm today, big difference. Fewer people for sure today, and much more capital equipment, meaning reapers that cost $1 million plus. Farming implements that again are very, very expensive. And why do we go out there and why do we employ those or buy that farming equipment, that very, very expensive farming equipment? Because it's more productive, it's more efficient, you lower your overall cost. It's straightforward, right? So how is this productivity? We'll call this a productivity dividend. So how is that passed on to the household as consumer? To reinforce or to reinforce that whole idea of efficiency, maximum number of goods and services for the lowest possible price. First stop is at the firm. Firm reduces its cost, increases its efficiency, productivity as a result, and lowers its cost. And that additional reduction of cost, you're able to. Would you initially want to pass those cost savings on to your consumer? Nope, you don't want to do that. You want to not do that as long as possible. But this is where the invisible hand of competition steps in. And that's how it ultimately gets passed on to the household as consumer, okay? Through that whole competitive model. That again, more specifically, that free market capitalism, where somebody builds something cheaper, reduces their cost. Someone else is going to copy that process one way or another. If you build a better mousetrap, other producers are going to find out about it and they're going to copy your process. Just happens all the time. So again, how do we increase long-run productivity? It's straightforward. Technology, capital, restructuring. So what we mean by technology, we've talked about quite a bit. Capital is the technology. Capital meaning we're improving our capital. In this case, we're talking about physical capital, but it could also be human capital. So human capital in terms of gaining more education, getting a degree, or gaining some other specific knowledge associated with that productive process, that production process. The next piece is restructuring. And restructuring, typically when we think of restructuring, we think about, oh, we're going to lay people off. It doesn't necessarily have to be that with just the labor. It could also be restructuring in terms of what? Substituting some of that labor for with more physical capital, or so remember, labor, entrepreneurship, capital, land. So get better managers. Change your entrepreneurs. Again, when we talk about the capital, the physical capital, again, that's pretty straightforward. Lastly, the land piece. So the example where land could come into play would be if your business is in a very high tax jurisdiction, you may reach the point where your costs are too high, and by simply doing what? Moving your factory, moving your operation a few miles or hundreds of miles or thousands of miles overseas, for example, to China, for example, this is where restructuring, this could also be part of it. And how could that increase your productivity? Lowering your cost. Straightforward, straight, simple as that. So again, examples that we talk about with this is that moving from labor intensive to capital intensive, farming for sure, mining, absolutely. Mining is far different today than it was 100, 120 years ago. Technology transfer, this is pretty straightforward. Example have here would be textile mills. So textile mills were kind of started in the UK and the United Kingdom, Great Britain, back, I'm guessing, 19th century or earlier, maybe even in the 18th century. So the 1700s started developing textile mills and whatnot. And that technology somehow, some way, stolen probably, was adopted in the U.S. and likewise Japan, China, and Vietnam. That progression so far as textiles are concerned. So there's not much in the way of textiles being produced in the UK or the U.S. Probably not Japan, China more so, and Vietnam as well. Just another example of it, kind of coursing through the system. So again, low cost producer efficiency. This is again, the idea is that capital goes to where it is most efficient. Capital, again, we're talking about physical capital. So this is why you would have, when you think about where you want to produce something, you have to have the proper infrastructure and transportation and whatnot, but you're always looking at your lowest cost of your productive resources, not just your labor, your entrepreneurship, capital, and certainly land would also come into play. Anyway, interesting walk through this whole idea of productivity. So on we go again. We've talked about the business cycle before, and when we say the business cycle, what that really means is, and we'll be talking about it in more detail in another slide here, but again, keeping in mind that when we're looking at business cycles, it's driven by, those are ups and downs, economic cycles. They go up and they go down, etc. And this is primarily, if we think about it, these are indications of when it drops down, that'll be an indication of market failure. And I'll talk more about that kind of going forward. But remember, if you have at a firm, if you're able to, if the demand for your product goes down and you build inventory, what would you normally do? You would reduce your prices in order to clear out that surplus that would be there. And oftentimes, because of sticky prices or because of again, sticky prices, I'll leave that. I don't like that expression, but that's the best one I can come up with at the moment. Um, uh, uh, Anyhow, resistance to price resistance from resisting from lowering prices. The idea again is that what happens is when you clear the market like that, when you lower your prices to clear the market, it prevents this business cycle from this market failure from kind of rolling through the economy and growing into something more possibly down the road toward what a recession. So recession again is 2 consecutive quarters of negative real GDP growth. So just a quick look at the picture on the left, and that is a sloping upward to the right. So long-term trend slopes upward to the right. It's up and down, but there's a tendency for it to, the trajectory, the overall trajectory, if you smooth it out, it slopes upward to the right. So this is good. This is economic growth, by the way, right? So a couple of examples. Just to the right of that, we're looking at what happened in 2008. We had a recession, the Great Recession. And I just have out through 2019, but continues on from there, of course. The idea was that, yes, after a recession, we have a tendency to bounce back. And in the past, we've pretty much bounced back and gotten back on the previous trajectory. However, after the Great Recession, that was not the case. We pulled back and we did not get back to the previous trajectory. So more specifically, looking at the the graph on the bottom with the real GDP growth, again, sloping upward to the right, that's what we want to see. However, again, from 2008, when we had the Great Recession, it went down and it did not come back up. What we call that is like a V-shaped recovery where it goes down and then comes back up, gets back on that previous trajectory. We did not do that. So basically, we had no surprise, economic malaise going from, again, the recession all the way up through about 2000, up through COVID. And then what happened was that COVID, the bottom drop, we were kind of getting back closer to that previous trajectory. But in COVID times, it dropped again. And once again, we failed to get back up to that previous trajectory after COVID. So these are things that we're missing out on, leaving a lot on the table so far as economic growth is concerned. And one more time, I've mentioned this in the past quite a bit, but why is it that economic growth is so important? Why is GDP so important? Because that is all 2 steps down from GDP. We go from GDP, gross domestic product, down to GNP, gross national product, and then there's net national product, and underneath that is what? National income. I may have missed a step there, but I think that's about it. But the point again is that national income, all of us are concerned about our income, right? So this is why, again, that GDP growth is so darn important. So there's something called the Rule of 72, and it's also, I think, referred to as the Rule of 70. And basically the idea behind this is that how long does it take an investment to double? We'll start with the investment side first. It's also, it holds true for the economy as well, of course. So we're all interested about in our investments, right? So for example, if we had an investment that was growing at 8% per year, we take 72 divided by that 8%, forget about the percentage sign. 72 divided by 8 is equal to 9 years. So it takes 9 years for your investment to double. And the beauty of that is that, remember, so if it takes 9 years for your investment to double, so after the first 9 years, if you had $10,000, it goes up to $20,000. And then the next 9 years, it goes from $20,000 to $40,000. So it's that composite interest, right? This is the beauty of this of that Rule of 72 is that not composite, but compounded interest. Sorry about that. So compounding is that wonderful thing that Albert Einstein found to be the most intriguing thing, far more than the theory of relativity. And I'm kind of exaggerating, but he was really taken with this whole idea of compound interest. So in this case, again, we're saying that you just take 72 divided by 8, takes 9 years to double. So if you're at a lower rate, if you're receiving 6%, that takes 12 years. 3%, 24 years. 1.5%, 48 years. So now let's go from those our own personal investments, which we are more interested in many ways. But remember, we also want what? We want economic growth because that also ties into our what? Into our income. So if you think about it, we've really been growing at about under 2%. So let's just say 1.5% growth rate probably over the last 20 years or so on average. And the problem with that is that it would take 48 years or half a century roughly to do what? To double the economy, to grow your income, right? As opposed to 3%, so that's double that 1.5. It cuts the other part of that in half. It only takes 24 years. So remember that 3% growth rate is kind of the average growth rate that we've experienced in the past. So this is our mark that we want to hit every year. Actually, we would like to have much, much more. But again, this is the rule of 72, something really simple. One of these things that I want you to take away from this class is so, so important. Okay, just to kind of keep that in mind. The rule of 72 or the rule of 70. Again, these are just rules of thumb, but they work. I mean, it's something that the relationship is pretty solid. So back again to our business cycle or our economic cycle, what I had referenced before is that a business cycle equates to that market failure. So again, we're starting at the top, we're full employed, so we have zero cyclical unemployment. Then the next thing we see is falling productivity, meaning that we're starting to do what? Building inventories. We're building inventories and we haven't slowed down our process, or we are starting to slow down our process, so we end up with what? Falling productivity. And then the three mark is that when we start to finally lay people off, and so we're getting unemployment, the U3 unemployment on the rise. And then we reach the point where, so far as the unemployment is concerned, people are giving up looking for work, and this is where the discouraged worker effect comes into play, where the unemployment rate actually drops. And because people are no longer looking for work. So remember, to be counted as U3 unemployed, you have to be what? Unemployed, but actively seeking employment. So if you give up looking for work, you're not actively seeking employment. Therefore, you're not counted as unemployed. So the next piece is that if it stays down long enough, 2 consecutive quarters of negative real GDP growth, then we have a recession. Coming out of the recession, we would have rising productivity, meaning that you're not going to go out there and hire more people in. You're going to use the staff that you currently have, and you're going to do what? Have them work more overtime, etc. And then what happens is the encouraged worker effect kicks in. This is where jobs start to show up and people start again looking for work. They're not employed just yet, so the unemployment rate actually goes up. And this is not a bad sign, it is a good sign. That's the encouraged worker effect, again, where the unemployment rate actually goes up. And then finally, when we're moving along, getting the economy moving back to full employment, that unemployment rate, that U3 unemployment rate drops down, right? So when we measure GDP, so gross domestic product, it's measured by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, which is under the Department of Commerce, under the Commerce Department. And so this is done on a quarterly basis, and then of course they're total together. It's not straight shot like adding them together and dividing by 4, but it's done on a quarterly basis. And so the first quarter of 2025, we had a negative real GDP. So we were on the way to what? On the way to recession. But the good news was, second quarter we popped back up, approaching 4%. Third quarter went over 4%. And the fourth quarter fell back down to just a shade over 1%. The reason that the fourth quarter dropped so much was because of the government shutdown. And you're thinking, How does that how does that equate to a fall off in economic growth? Remember, when we talk about the components, the things that go into into that GDP number are the consumer spending, PCE, personal consumption expenditures, investments, that's the firm again, building machinery and equipment for the firm, if you will. And the next, of course, would be, we'll say exports being produced at the firm, and we actually net those out against the imports. It's called net exports of goods and services, NEGS. But the component the missing component was that we had over a month of government shutdown, and so that impacted government spending. For better or for worse, actually it's for worse, of course, because government is going to make up for what they didn't spend. And anyway, point is that we ended up overall for the year with GDP growth of 2.2%, which is pretty anemic. Remember, we want 3%. So a lot of that is owed to two bad quarters. The first quarter was negative, and the fourth quarter was significantly lower because, again, because government shutdown. Not a good thing. Not a good thing, folks. So looking at, again, that was the change in real GDP. That was on a percentage basis. And now I just want to take a look at, when we look at the overall economy, how big it really is. So the U.S., the nominal GDP was at close to $31 trillion in 2025, and the real GDP was close to $24 trillion, or $24 trillion in 2025. So nominal GDP, again, is not adjusting for inflation, meaning these are inflated dollars. This is the example that I used before was, or that I like to turn to, is that you take a dollar bill out of your pocket today, out of your purse, out of your wallet, right? Put it back into your wallet, purse, and you come back a year later, you take that dollar out, and it's still worth what? $1. However, if we have 10% inflation over that period of time, in a real sense, adjusting for inflation, that $1 that we take out of our wallet or out of our purse that year down the road, while it looks like it's $1, its buying power, its spending power is 90 cents. It's been reduced by 10%. Remember, this is an old line, is not how much you earn, it's how much what you earn can buy. This is why that when we're making these adjustments for inflation, for this real GDP number, why it's so important for us as individuals, as households. This is the thing that we all pay the closest attention to. So again, just a huge economy, right? 31 trillion dollars nominal GDP. So again, and this is loaded with the inflation nonetheless. It's a huge number. And the real GDP number is at $24 trillion in 2025. So another kind of way of looking at this is that I found these are interesting. Some really neat images that are out there, and I like to kind of stick with government statistics and whatnot. But these are cool. So I want to just share these with you. And so if we're looking at, again, the left-hand side, we're looking at economic growth, GDP growth over 26 years from 1998 through 2024. And when you look at it, it makes sense. Places like in the West in particular, in the South as well, but more so in the West, we saw lots and lots of economic growth. North Dakota having a very, very high 164% growth, and that is attributed to what? Oil. The major oil finds in the Bakken oil fields, and South Dakota, similar. California, of course, they're having their troubles now, but the reason it grew so much, so rapidly, and remember, California is the largest state in the union, 38 million people, roughly speaking. But the GDP took off in California because of Silicon Valley, primarily. Okay, that massive growth in Silicon Valley, in technology. All the names that we see out there now, NVIDIA and Google and Facebook or Meta, and go through the whole laundry list. But again, this is where all that economic growth took place. Unfortunately, Michigan, not so much, at 30%, down in the lower categories, and a lot of that, the Rust Belt, the Midwest, the manufacturing heartland, as it's noted here, that was problematic. Problematic because of what? Because of the loss of manufacturing jobs from 1998. Actually, within 5 or 6 years of 1998, by the time the Great Recession, lost a huge chunk of our manufacturing, where it had been pushed over to China, restructured. Anyway, the other thing to note is just a couple of quick hits, and one is that Florida, Texas, absolutely exploding over these times too. Again, this is something where, again, watching at the GDP growth over that time, it's amazing. Onward to the right, this is a breakout of like the current GDP by state. So this is what we call a GSP, or gross state product, individually, and this is just the percentage contribution to the overall U.S. GDP, really, right? No surprise, California is the largest one by far, 14.5%. It's a huge economy, and it's often noted that if California were to be an economy on its own, it would probably be up there with the top 5, maybe after India or after Japan, I forget. Anyway, you get the idea. California is absolutely enormous. Lots of problems now, but nonetheless, it's a major contributor to the overall economic, the wealth of the, excuse me, not the wealth, but the overall GDP in the country. No surprises. Texas, again, huge population right after California. And then after that would be New York, and following New York would be Florida. Good stuff here, people. So changing gears a little bit, talking about economic growth, this whole notion of economic growth, the modern development of this idea of economic growth, it goes back to, and you can say it goes back much further than this, and it's debatable. This is not something set in stone, but generally speaking, people kind of look at 1776 as the starting point of it. And the reason they do is because of Adam Smith. Adam Smith wrote a book called An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, or just the Wealth of Nations for short. He was Scottish, and he was part of what's called the Scottish Enlightenment. And anyhow, what you'll notice is that 1776 is one of those years you'll remember, of course, because guess what? That is the birth of the U.S. was in 1776 as well. Anyway, so Adam Smith, just very briefly, Adam Smith was what was called a moral philosopher, and before the Wealth of Nations, he wrote a book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is, some people would argue that it's actually more important than the Wealth of Nations, but we'll stick with the Wealth of Nations. In the moral sentiments, this is where he kind of came up with why it is. This is where he kind of formulated that idea of that whole idea of the invisible hand, where people, by pursuing your own self-interest, you cannot, but you can't, you can't, but to you can only you can't avoid helping the overall, the overall society overall, really is what it kind of boils down to. Anyway, so it kind of sprang forth from this moral sentiments, meaning that people are going to be, they're going to, if they have an opportunity to do good things, they will. And that's, you might think that's not necessarily the case, but in general, that was the idea, the basis behind the moral sentiments, theory of moral sentiments, and also, frankly, behind the Wealth of Nations. All right, remember the invisible hand of competition. Anyhow, So this is kind of the wellspring. This is where it kind of started. In addition to that, we also have something else that happened in 1776 was very important, was an inventor by the name of James Watt. James Watt was, it's not that he didn't invent the steam engine, but he perfected it to the point where it was actually useful for industrial purposes. Because remember the textile industry sprang up in the UK and in Britain. And the problem with the textile mills was that they were tied to, you had to have your textile mill next to a stream or a river. And the reason that was the case was because you had to have that paddle wheel to generate power to turn the looms and to do all of your equipment, inside of that factory, because you had no other way of generating power. Well, James Watt came up with a steam engine, and the steam engine, what that allowed people to do is to move away from the river. Not that you didn't need water, because you need water for the steam, but you were not tied directly to that water source in terms of like having to have a moving stream or river. So this really helped to grow that textile industry in Britain. So again, these are important things that kind of cropped up. And The Wealth of Nations is very important. It's a huge book. I think it comes in two. I'm pretty sure there are two sections of it, if you will, that they were published in 1776, probably amounting to about 1,000 pages, and it's remarkable was all that's in it. I'm not going to get into any more than that. But anyways, this was the genesis, if you will, of that modern economic growth. And based with that modern economic growth, there was some things to kind of keep in mind. One is a strong property rights. What that means is that when we think about property rights, we think about land. It's not just the property, not just the land. It goes well beyond that. Think about as an individual, what is it that you have? What is it that you own? Yes, you might own a house, or you might, want to own a house, or you may own part of a house, if you have a mortgage and whatnot. But it's not just the land; it's also what? Your money, your savings. If you have a business, if you own the business, or if you have, further, when we talk about down below, we talk about patents, copyrights, and trademarks. So the intellectual property rights, lots of different types of property rights that are out there. And the reason that these are so darn important is because in order to grow your property, in order to buy land, in order to do this, in order to do that, there's the incentive is that you're able to actually do what? Keep it, right? So if you don't have that ability to keep that land, if you don't have the ability, to maintain, your own property rights, what is the incentive for you to try to make that happen? To grow your business, to grow your bank account, to save, These are kind of it sounds very, very simple, but it's extremely, extremely powerful. Anyway, again, I mentioned patents, copyrights, and trademarks. Got more on that in a minute. But one of the downsides to this was that there was a concern over this uneven aspect of growth, of economic growth. The income distribution, the Gini coefficient, we'll talk more about that at another point in time. But the idea is that there's always a concern that with this economic growth, there's disparate income distribution, meaning that you have people that benefit from it and make lots and lots of money, and others not so much. And the typical view that we have of this, so this is kind of the quote unquote the downside of this, is we think about like those textile mills. Yes, they were wonderful. They were very efficient, and relatively speaking, actually in absolute sense, they were extremely efficient relative, to individuals making their own clothing. But they'd have these small children. Think about Charles Dickens, small children working in these textile mills. And the reason they would like small children was because they had small hands, so they could get into the equipment, into the machinery, and forget about all the downside of that. But the takeaway is that we say that it doesn't benefit all people equally, right? That income distribution. We'll talk more about that, but this is kind of the downside, when people think about this whole idea of modern economic growth, right? So kind of lastly, to kind of wrap this up, I mentioned before about patents, trademarks, copyrights, and patents, just to kind of give you an idea. So trademarks, again, those are branding, if you will, that would be out there. And so you always own that. It's something like Coca-Cola, for example, would be a trademark, or a copyright on something would be like a book, on books, etc. And the time limit on those goes anywhere from 70 to 170 years, and all this is debatable, or it's something that it could end up in the courts. But these are kind of general, again, rules of thumb. Patents for drugs, for pharmaceuticals, etc. 15 to 20 years. So that's just a kind of a snapshot of those different types of intellectual property rights, how you're supposed to do this. And by the way, what is the rationale behind trademarks, copyrights, and patents? To protect a person's property, of course. However, there's another idea behind this too, and it's really from an economic perspective, it makes sense, is that it is your opportunity to do what? To recover your opportunity cost. All the time, the blood, sweat, and tears that you put into developing that product, developing that, writing that book, and inventing that product that's out there. So, but remember also, from an economics perspective, it's to recover your opportunity cost, no more, no less. That can those there's it's easy to see where some of these processes, this patent process has been, um, people are getting more than their opportunity cost. So we've certainly seen cases where that's happened, and we've also seen cases uh, where people's property rights have been abridged, where people have, some people have stolen their ideas, their patents. Anyhow, so again, this is all part and parcel of what we talk about. This modern economic growth, this thing that we're talking about, is that competitive free market system. All right. So we also need efficient financial institutions, meaning banking. They have to be working correctly, properly, smoothly, efficiently, right? Literacy and education, developing the human capital, again, to the point where we're able to with this education piece, we're trying to grow that human capital, right? So that we can do what? Leisure. And remember, when we talk about leisure, your day is made up into two categories, if you will. One would be leisure, and the other one would be work. So what do we want? We want more leisure. And how do we get more leisure? By working more. Leisure is a normal good. Free trade, the last example of this would be comparative advantage. Comparative advantage meaning um, that both sides have to benefit in some way, shape, or form from this exchange. Otherwise, just like with technology, why would you participate in this trade if you did not benefit on both sides, right? Anyway, so again, there's a distinction here between competitive market system and competitive free market capitalism. What I mean by that is that competitive free market capitalism, this is where the invisible hand is present, right? Where the invisible hand is present, and we are the markets are truly competitive with each other. Not you don't have these. You certainly don't have monopolies. So the further away from monopoly you can get, the better. The closer we are to that competitive free market capitalism. So again, determining that economic growth, the determining factors, if you will. So we have to, increase the supply, and also we have to have the associated that effect of demand enough to absorb that supply. If you don't have enough, that's where we end up, when there's not enough demand, we end up with market failure. We end up with that back to that business cycle. So again, efficiency, again, I'll just read this, refers to the production of the most goods and services at the lowest possible price, maximum. Again, you as a consumer, you're getting the biggest bang for your buck. Also, the firm is also interested in efficiency, lowering their cost, right? So the production possibility curve is pushed out. We've seen this over and over again with our economic growth year after year, that pushing that GDP, growing that real GDP, that is the production possibility curve being pushed out. The more rapidly pushed out, the better. And we'll talk about, there's upsides and downsides to that too. We'll talk about that a bit later. The consumption possibilities curve, this was another thing they talked about earlier on, and that is that if we're going to be importing goods and services, we're going to be able to increase our consumption. And the reason we would like to do that, theoretically anyhow, is that if we want to do what, use more of our productive resources toward the capital goods, so that we can grow the economy that way for later on by, this consumption possibilities, by doing what? By going out and importing more goods that could fill some of that space on the consumer side, right? So far as consumer goods are concerned. Lastly, one thing I wanted to bring up, this last item is actually very, very important. So when we talk about the U.S. economy being so big, remember, 25–30% of the overall world economy is the U.S. so far as that GDP, that gross domestic product, or that gross world product is concerned. The U.S. has a huge portion of that. The idea is that with this locomotive effect, if the U.S. economy is growing, chances are we will also be doing what? Back to that consumption possibilities curve, we will be importing more goods and services, right? And by importing more goods and services, what does that do? It helps grow the other economies in the world. So this is, again, this locomotive effect, this is something that we're experiencing currently. Yes, in spite of tariffs, our imports are increasing. It's not a bad thing. Because remember those countries that are exporting to us, our imports, the tariffs are being paid, and those products are still flowing in, or increasingly flowing in. As an aside, we're also seeing much more in terms of our exports. So this is kind of a win-win, if you will. And again, that's why this locomotive effect is something that you don't hear about it much, but it's something extremely, extremely important. Anyway, that's a wrap, folks. Thank you.